When I think of a great movie that reflects our modern day society, the first movie that usually comes to mind is The Dark Knight. By now it is clear to many that The Dark Knight roughly parallels the war on terror in post-9/11 America, but merely looking at this from a political angle is in my opinion too simple of an approach. I think what is really at stake here is how terrorism changed our perception of risk and as a consequence our perception of ourselves and our society, our heroes and our villains, our virtues and our vices. In this video I'm going to explore how these issues are represented in The Dark Knight and vice versa, how grounding a fictional story in real life issues elevated The Dark Knight to its now legendary status. So let's begin. When trying to understand the driving forces of our modern society, I can't think of a better place to start than with German sociologist Ulrich Beck and his Risk Society thesis. In the late 20th century, he presented his argument that the risks of modernity, ranging from political to environmental and economic risks, followed from its triumphs.
Modern society has become a risk society in the sense that it is increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risk that it itself has produced.
In other words, we were suffering from the consequences of the victory of modernity, the unintended side effects of progress that were increasingly dominating the public realm. I think this shift from a modernity of linear progression towards one that had to respond to this progression can be observed between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. In Batman Begins, Bruce Wayne seeks to free his city from corruption and crime by using Batman as the driving force, and by the end of the film he has made notable progress in that goal. A progress that Gotham responds to in The Dark Knight, in which the consequences of Batman's actions become a growing subject of discussion. This refers to the intended consequences as well as the unintended ones. At the end of Batman Begins, Inspector Gordon already warned Batman of the possibility of new risks and uncertainties that come with introducing a new entity like Batman to Gotham's status quo.
We start wearing Kevlar. They buy armor-piercing rounds. And you're wearing a mask. Jumping off rooftops.
In The Dark Knight, the initial optimism resulting from Batman's success becomes challenged by these unintended consequences that greatly impact the perception of risk. Traditionally, risk is measured by the chance and impact of an event, which implies a certain degree of knowledge on both of these elements. Beck pointed out how this model of measuring risk is practically rendered useless in this new phase of modernity that is dealing with increasingly significant unknown variables that undermine our trust in adequately determining the chance and impact of an event. Moving into the 21st century, this became even more evident, for however unpredictable risks had become, in Beck's earlier work they were still blows of fate, of bad fortune, understood in the dialectic terms of goods and bads. And then came 9/11.
And now you have to move from talk about a possible accident to talk about something deliberate.
This has to be deliberate, folks.
Why do you say that was definitely on purpose?
Because it just flew straight into it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
I think we have a terrorist act of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
The crash of these two aircraft into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York appear to be an act of terrorism.
The terrorist attacks on 9/11 can be seen as a black swan event, a term coined by risk analyst Nassim Nicholas Taleb to conceptualize events that are completely unpredictable but carry an extreme impact. Terrorism fundamentally changed how we perceive risk because it replaced chance with purpose. It introduced malicious intent into an equation that was mostly focused on the accidental. Beck emphasizes that although we can more or less ensure and protect ourselves from chance and accidents, we are utterly defenseless against this concept of terrorism that turns every human being into a potential danger.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
In The Dark Knight, we see this purposeful terror in the Joker, a villain that no one saw coming until it was already too late. Not Gordon, not the mob, not even Batman, whose risk perception of criminals mostly seemed to consist of figuring out their goal.
Criminals aren't complicated, Alfred. We just need to figure out what he's after.
The Joker, however, doesn't seem driven by anything, doesn't seem to desire or want anything, and because of that he is the pure embodiment of this malicious intent, this will to terrorize, the ultimate representation of the idea that deep down every human being poses a fundamental risk.
I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other.
One important distinction that needs to be made here is that risk is not synonymous with catastrophe. Risk is the anticipation of catastrophe. They are always future events that may occur that threaten us. The terror in The Dark Knight doesn't come from the impact of specific events, it arises from its anticipation. The anticipation that follows from the Joker announcing pretty much everything he's planning to do. The Dark Knight is filled with this type of suspense, the anticipation of the Joker assassinating city officials and blowing up a hospital, the anticipation of ordinary citizens resorting to deadly violence, and the anticipation of boat passengers sacrificing each other to save themselves. It is this anticipation of the Joker's terror that is unraveling Gotham, just like the anticipation of terrorism, according to Beck arguably more so than the actual act of terrorism, is unraveling the Western world. Ironically, because the measures we take against the risk of terrorism seem to be eroding the very institutions of democracy and freedom we want to protect from it. This is most notable with the restricting of individual liberties in the hope of security, represented in The Dark Knight by the significant intrusion of privacy by Batman's sonar device.
Unethical, dangerous. This is wrong.
I've got to find this man, Lucius.
At what cost?
But it can also be found in the growing distrust in the institutions that are supposed to protect us and in the growing wariness towards our fellow human beings. This more abstract notion of the consequences of the anticipation of catastrophe is symbolized by the soul of Gotham, which, if you've seen the essay from Lessons from the Screenplay, is exactly what Batman and the Joker are battling for towards the end, a representation of what is perhaps the fundamental struggle of our time.
I have enough blood on my hands. And I've seen now what I would have to become to stop men like him.
The most important question that remains is, what can we do against this terror? How can we regain security and control in this time of fear and uncertainty? The Joker shows us how terrorism attacks precisely those values that allow it to happen, and how the anticipation of catastrophe forces us to reflexively act based on increasingly unreliable risk perceptions that can lead to self-defeating consequences. For example, in a scene that led to some confusion, the Joker switches the location of where Rachel and Harvey are being held hostage, and in a dark twist of fate, Batman ends up losing Rachel exactly because he acted out of the anticipation of losing her. For it is in this anticipation that he didn't take into account the possibility of the Joker deliberately corrupting the information he gives to Batman. This doesn't necessarily make Batman guilty of Rachel's death, it just shows the futility of our traditional models of risk assessment when attempting to take human will into account, a variable that almost by definition presents limitless possibilities, some of which are bound to lead to catastrophe. Still, facing the concrete consequences of acting based on increasingly intangible information can have devastating effects on our perception of ourselves. Losing Rachel is a turning point for both Batman, who loses his composure for the first time and feels responsible for what happened, and Harvey Dent, who loses his ideals and turns into a villain.
What happened to Rachel wasn't chance. We decided to act. We three. Then why was it me who was the only one who lost everything? It wasn't.
To me, it is a bleak reminder that this is not an issue that we can conceptualize in the traditional terms of good versus bad, of us versus them. Because as much as we'd like to isolate ourselves in our moral codes and create a safe space for our morality, the Joker reveals that these walls we put up between ourselves and that which we consider to be a threat are an illusion. This is not a battle fought somewhere far away, this is a battle on home turf, a battle for our soul. We are all part of this, and whatever we choose to do, however we act in the anticipation of catastrophe is vital for our fate.
You thought we could be decent men in an indecent time! You were wrong.
I greatly admire how The Dark Knight doesn't give us one favored response, one obvious solution to this fight, because in reality there simply isn't one. Instead, it shows the multitude of reactions, like trading in freedom for security, taking morality out of the equation, simply trusting in the goodness of humanity, and fabricating a reality to provide people with some sense of certainty. Ultimately, The Dark Knight reflects a society that is radically changed in the face of terrorism and forced to explore new ways of coping with fundamental risks that have broken down the societal and personal securities we once found comfort in. By taking these real-world issues and weaving them into the fabric of the narrative, The Dark Knight uses one of our most beloved heroes to help us understand this ongoing battle for our soul and the price we've paid in fighting it, the part of ourselves that we've lost. For regardless how you feel about Batman's sacrifice at the end of the film, there's only one thing that's for sure: our hero as we know him is gone forever.